You are listening to the Navigating Adult ADHD podcast, where it's all about education, support, and coaching for adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Zena, a late diagnosed ADHDer, here to help you unpack the challenges, frustrations, and the positive side of living with ADHD. With my no BS approach, I'll help you to better understand your unique ADHD brain and how you can work with it to feel better, increase your self-confidence, improve your relationships, and ultimately achieve your goals. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to Navigating Adult ADHD. Hello, how are you today? I am so excited for us to talk about this episode today. This is co-occurring conditions. And if you have ADHD, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming you do, there is a very high likelihood that you have another condition alongside ADHD. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I just wanted to remind you before we dive into that, because I feel like I haven't asked for a while, if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're loving what you're learning and listening to here, it would be so amazing. It would give me a huge boost of dopamine too, if you would leave us a review, if you would give us a 5-star review and tell us what you're loving about the podcast. Leave a little comment so that other people can understand what they are going to hear and listen and expect and get from it. That would be amazing, and I would be so grateful. It helps more adults who are navigating ADHD to find us. So thank you for doing that. So do you feel like you are struggling with symptoms that don't seem to improve even after you've got your ADHD diagnosis and you've started treatment? So maybe you're dealing with overwhelming anxiety or like extreme mood swings, like really extreme, unexplainable, or maybe it's just real difficulty learning new things. And maybe you're wondering, is this ADHD or could this be something else, right? If that sounds familiar, you're definitely not alone, because according to Dr. Russell Barkley, adults with ADHD have a 50 to 80% likelihood of having another condition alongside ADHD. Okay, so in this episode, we are talking about co-occurring conditions, what they are, why they are so common for ADHDers, and how to recognize when something else could be going on, okay? And of course, I'm going to share with you plenty of personal experiences, okay? I'm going to share about, obviously, my ADHD, but also a lot of anxiety that I've experienced. Plus, I'm going to give you some tips of what you can do if you think that you may have a separate co-occurring condition, okay? So let's dive in. So firstly, we are going to start with what are co-occurring conditions. All right. So co-occurring, oh my gosh, we're off to a great start. Co-occurring conditions were previously referred to, and you may still see this, read this, hear this. They were referred to as comorbidities. Okay. That term is no longer used going forward, and co-occurring conditions is the correct term. Okay. So they are additional conditions that exist alongside having ADHD, right? So some common examples of this could be depression or anxiety. Then there's obsessive compulsive disorder, so OCD. There's also oppositional defiance disorder, ODD. Then we've got learning disabilities, for example, dyslexia. And then we've got language disabilities and tic disorders, okay? So I'm going to explain a little bit more of those and what they look like, okay? But I just wanted to give you a quick little brief overview of some of the things you may have heard of. Now, these can either be, one, caused by ADHD-related struggles, right? Like having anxiety because you felt constantly behind your whole life, okay? Or they can be a completely separate condition to the ADHD, right? Like perhaps having dyslexia or autism, right? And there's a lot of overlap between them, but they actually impact different areas of your life. Okay, we're going to dive into this a little bit more to help you understand what this means. So, for example, I was diagnosed with anxiety, I believe, as like a late teen or somewhere in my teens. And I remember when I saw a psychologist for my eating disorder, he told me it was, anxiety based, right? But what I didn't know back then, when I saw that psychologist, I think I was about 18, was that my anxiety was fueled by undiagnosed ADHD. Okay, so growing up, my anxiety was mostly triggered around school or social situations, right? So at school, when I had to change classrooms, or there were big events, or when I was not understanding what was expected of me. But when I was comfortable, like when I was at home, the anxiety completely disappeared. Right? So that's how I'm able to tell that my anxiety was part of my undiagnosed ADHD, right? It was part of having ADHD. It was not a standalone disorder. So once I treated the ADHD, right, and I started using tools like coaching and emotional regulation, my anxiety improved dramatically, right? I have very little anxiety these days. So again, at least half of us with ADHD also have one or more co-occurring conditions. Now, these can complicate diagnosis, right? They can complicate diagnosis and treatment, especially for women, right? Many women, especially those who have more of the inattentive type of ADHD, they are more likely to be misdiagnosed or go undiagnosed, right? So some common co-occurring conditions. Let's go through some of these and explain like what they look like and what to look for, right? So I've broken them into categories, starting with mood disorders. So that's anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. So if your ADHD has not been treated in the past and is newly diagnosed, right? If you are diagnosed later in life, like me as an adult, then your ADHD is often going to be accompanied by some anxiety or perhaps some depression, right? Very common for those late diagnosed in life, right? Myself included. So anxiety, symptoms of anxiety can include persistent worry, feeling on edge, chronic stress, fatigue, trouble sleeping, and about 50% of adults with ADHD also experience anxiety, okay? Then we've got depression. So depression is that persistent sadness, lack of motivation, and feelings of hopelessness, okay? ADHDers often can feel like a failure for not being able to keep up, and that can really trigger and kind of fuel depression. Then we've got bipolar disorder. So this is extreme mood swings between high energy like mania, manic, and low energy depression. Now, unlike ADHD, right, we do have high highs and low lows as ADHDers, right? ADHD mood shifts are different in comparison to bipolar. Bipolar cycles can appear without any external triggers and last for days or weeks. Whereas for ADHD, there's usually an external trigger, like, something that happens that sets us off, right? High or low. So then other neurodevelopmental conditions are autism and tic disorders. So autism, which might be referred to as ASD, autism spectrum disorder, okay? So very briefly, there's a lot I could say about that, but I'm just going to sum it up with challenges with social communication, sensory processing, and emotional regulation. Now, a lot of those symptoms, they overlap with ADHD, making it pretty hard to actually distinguish the two, okay? Personally, I have looked into autism a lot for myself because I have seen that a lot of the things I do, I have heard with people I sort of follow on social media and books I've read, etc., that they are very common autistic traits. So I thought, maybe I have autism. And now there are some like free online sort of self-screening tools, shall we say, that you can take. And I took one of those and it said no. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Well, then I think there's a lot of overlap, which of course makes so much sense, but I don't really fit the full profile for autism. Okay. So again, it can be tricky to distinguish. I'm actually listening to a really great audiobook. Crap, I can't think what it is called, but I will update you next time, about somebody who is ADHD. So they have both autism and ADHD. And so again, she's talking about how so many of the symptoms are, they overlap and can be very similar. So autism is one, and then the next one is tics, right? So the tics disorder. So that was the sudden uncontrollable movements or sounds, right? It could be like blinking. It could be like often what we know as tics is like people yelling and swearing, or saying inappropriate things. It could be things like throat clearing, right? And it could be just like movement, like real rapid, quick movement. These are often more common in ADHD children, but they can also persist into adulthood, okay? Then we've got learning disorders. So I have got 5 here, starting with dyslexia. So dyslexia, difficulty with reading, spelling, and writing. I have wondered if I could have had dyslexia for a while, but I don't believe that I do. It's just because of my undiagnosed ADHD, I have developed certain things that, make certain elements of reading, spelling, and writing more difficult for me. Okay, so I definitely have some of that, but it's more in relation to the undiagnosed ADHD and the difficulty in that regard that I had for so long. So again, right, this is really common. So I kind of have that co-occurring condition, but not as a separate condition, if that makes sense, right? So dyslexia is one, dyscalculia. So that is when you have difficulty with math concepts and calculations. Dysgraphia is difficulty with handwriting and fine motor skills. I've actually had a client who is in this category, and she was told to get a pen. You can get this pen and you push a little button on it and it actually records what is being said, and then it can be typed out for you. Like, there are some really amazing things that you can get, like supportive tools and accommodations when you know what you're experiencing, what you're dealing with, right? So that was dysgraphia. Then we've got auditory processing disorder, difficulty processing and understanding auditory information, right? So for example, if somebody's trying to give you directions and you really struggle to understand what they are trying to tell you to do, right? That's auditory processing disorder. And then we've got visual processing disorder. So difficulty processing and understanding visual information. Okay. So like maybe you struggle to read a map or instructions, when you get one of those friggin' kit set boxes. My partner got one the other day. He decided we needed some new shelves in the bedroom, right? Some for the books, right? Bookshelves. And he got some, and I walked in there and he's halfway through making it. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Yep. And I go back and he's like, I've got screws left over. I was like, oh, there's always a screw loose, isn't there? Yeah. So he had not followed the instructions. I was like, at least it's not too wonky this time. But that was back to my example of visual processing disorder, right? When you've got to follow the instructions of one of those kit sets, that might be a time where that could show up. So next is behavioral disorders. So this is your ODD or your CD. So starting with CD, that is conduct disorder. So that can be kind of recognized by persistent aggression towards other people and a real strong pattern of rule-breaking behavior. Okay. Then you've got ODD, which is your oppositional defiant disorder, right? So that is the ongoing defiance and the anger-driven disobedience, okay? Now, I definitely think that many of us with ADHD have an element of kind of being somewhat defiant, right? We can definitely have an element of that. But this is a whole nother level. I remember watching a documentary here in New Zealand. We had, Sonia Gray, we had her on the podcast a while back. But she did a documentary with her daughter and, demonstrated how these show up in teens. And she shared the story of her daughter disappearing. And I think she actually shared some of that on the podcast with us, but how that real strong behavior showed up, right? If I could think of the documentary, I'm so sorry I can't. You're probably thinking of it. If you live in New Zealand, you're yelling it at me right now, probably. But yeah, again, sorry, can't remember all the things today. So that was a real quick overview, right, of some of the common co-occurring conditions. So the question is, right, is it ADHD or is it actually something else, right? So let's talk about how to actually tell the difference, okay? The overlap between ADHD and co-occurring conditions can make it pretty hard to untangle what is ADHD and what's not. So when we only have ADHD, right, treatment is often life-changing. Now, by treatment, I mean a multitude of things, not just medication, okay? So stimulants or non-stimulants, right? Especially when paired with coaching. Hello, I'm a coach. I'm a huge fan of that, right? But when paired with coaching or therapy, right? Therapy is excellent too, as well as lifestyle changes, right? And having accommodations at work and exercise. Exercise is massive for a multitude of reasons, right? Not because you should exercise, but because for your ADHD brain, it does so many amazing, wonderful things, right? So again, when we have only ADHD, treatment is often life-changing. And by treatment, I mean a multitude of things, right? Those things can dramatically help to improve our symptoms. They don't fully go away, right? We don't just turn off the ADHD. It's always there, right? But it can really dramatically help to improve symptoms, especially when we have a treatment plan that really helps us to work with our brains. Now, of course, that takes time. I always say you need to allow a year to get that really dialed in. Sometimes it might even be longer than that, okay? Because I know for me, it took me at least a year, I'd say just over a year, to find the right medication for me, my body, the right dosage, the right time of day to take it, all of the things, and also find, the right sort of lifestyle accommodations and activities and like high protein and all these different things that I could combine to really help me thrive. Okay. Now, even with some of the co-occurring conditions that we've gone through that we may experience, you may notice that with ADHD treatment, these also dramatically improve. Okay. So to give you a rough idea, for me, what my kind of treatment plan looks like is I use stimulant medication. I'm on Vyvanse. I exercise every single day. I have a high protein diet, and I use coaching, so mind management and emotional regulation specifically, all right? But if some symptoms persist or even get worse, then it could be a signal that a separate condition is happening, okay? For example, if you have treated your ADHD, but you still have really intense anxiety, it could be worth screening for an anxiety disorder, right? Or if reading and writing is like a really difficult struggle for you, then you could have like a learning difficulty present, right? You could maybe be experiencing dyslexia or dyscalculia or dysgraphia, right? Or a combination of those. So a key question to ask here is, are these symptoms happening everywhere? Okay? Are these symptoms happening everywhere? So is this anxiety happening at work? Is it happening at home? Is it happening socially? Is it happening when I'm on vacation lying on the beach? Everywhere, right? If these symptoms are happening everywhere and all the time, then there's a strong likelihood that it is a separate co-occurring condition, right? Or is it only happening in certain situations, right? Like I gave you my anxiety example before, where it was like really only happening in like school. It happened a lot in school situations and like social situations. And again, it happened in work, but it wasn't happening at home. It wasn't happening like outside of that. Okay. So what do you do if you suspect that you have got a co-occurring condition? All right. 3 steps, my friend. Nice and simple. Number 1, track the patterns. Write down when and where the symptoms show up and how long they last, right? Keep a track, make some notes, write some shit down, okay? Don't trust your brain to remember it. That's like the funniest thing we say to ourselves. I'll remember that. Bullshit. Track it, my friend. Write some shit down, right? So number 1, track the patterns. Number 2, try some online screening tools. Right? So there are some self-assessment tools which you can do for like autism, anxiety, dyslexia, etc. Like there are some online screening tools. So have a look at those and sort of go through and see what you can learn from that. Number 3 is talk to a professional. Okay? Find somebody who is ADHD informed. All right? An ADHD formed, psychiatrist, psychologist, medical professional who can help you, who can evaluate you. Right? Again, that's likely to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Lastly, co-occurring conditions are really common for us and they are manageable. Okay, especially once we know what we are dealing with, once we know what's really going on, right? I have coached and supported people who have a variety of co-occurring conditions, right? So there's been some autism, dysgraphia, dyslexia, anxiety, depression, so many things, okay? And for me, like treating ADHD has completely changed how I'm experiencing and handling the anxiety, right? So for so many ADHDers, the right combination of medication, coaching, or therapy and lifestyle changes is absolutely life-changing, okay? You've got this, my friend. Huge love. Take care. I'll speak to you next week. Hey friend, if you feel like your ADHD is holding you back and you just don't really know where to start, ADHD Home was made for you. It's what I wish I'd had when I was first diagnosed at 36, feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, and just really struggling to figure out how to work with my brain. Inside ADHD Home, you will find everything you need to finally get unstuck and start making real progress towards your goals. You've got over 60 videos designed to help you understand, manage, and thrive with ADHD. Plus, you get regular coaching calls from me. You've got a safe place to ask your questions, get support. There are masterclasses each month on ADHD topics like RSD and emotional regulation. And you have a community of other adults with ADHD who have got your back. Inside ADHD Home, you will learn how to take control of your life and start feeling better. You'll feel seen, supported, and equipped with everything you need to build the life you have always wanted. Visit adhdhome.co.nz. My friend, it is time to make ADHD work for you. Let's go.